The Old Mill, staple of industry, glory years of Cleveland, Tennessee. Today you would think that this building was an image of prosperity and honor. It was at some point. However, by sinister intervention, this building had once become a beacon of evil, a wellspring of misfortune, the remnants of which still lingered today. One would like to think supernatural events don't take place, especially in small, unassuming towns such as Cleveland. This, however, is not the case. The malicious series of events that have swept through Cleveland can no longer go unnoted. It is time for the untold horrors of Cleveland to be told. He knew what he had to do. There was no choice at this point. He had nowhere to go. He walked out of the house towards the old shack in the backyard. The door opened with a shuddering creak. The full moon beamed tauntingly in the sky. He grabbed all the gas cans and headed to mount his horse. Before he was ostracized entirely, Henry was very close with the family that owned the gas station. He knew they kept a reserve east of town in case of shortages. Heading that way, he spurred his horse onward, cart in tow. His sworn vengeance a divine release. He had only one chance. He would seal his demise and ensure that this rightful vengeance, too long delayed, was finally enacted. This was more important than his own life. What more was there to lose, he asked himself. The baleful crimson moon was his only illumination. He rode down the gravel road, noting the shed in the middle of the field. He stopped the cart behind the shed, ensuring no one would bear witness. He felt as if something was watching him. He circled. The feeling prevailed. It felt heavy, malicious, evil. He started filling the tanks. As he filled the fourth one, he heard an undeniable scurry of movement. It sounded like it was below him. The ground shook slightly. He had never heard something like that. It sounded as if there was a stampede beneath him. What on earth made a noise like that, he asked himself. He hurriedly filled the last two and remounted. He began to doubt himself. What was about to happen hung in his hands entirely. The weight settled in. He started back toward the mill. The sound was directed toward that very spot. He shuddered. Chapter 1. Life is bright and peachy in Cleveland. Henry Hedford, 24, muscular with a farmer's tan, walked down Lowry Street from his house toward Inman. The year was 1921. Henry waved at Timothy Trafford. He was quite used to this routine, as Timothy was usually outside the house to see the kids off for school.
"Good day, sir,"
Henry said, in his heavy southern accent.
Well, look at you. I expect you to bring me back a wool jacket. Winds are getting chilly.
Henry smiled. They both laughed.
"I will if you'll give me that old gray in the back,"
Henry responded. The woolen mill, Henry's place of work, was a factory that processed wool. It was actually the only factory at that time to both process wool and create clothing in the same building. From the sheep's back to the clothing rack was the saying. Henry didn't mind his job. It paid the bills, barely. He prided himself on being one of the best workers, always on time, doing more work than most. Still, the pay scarcely covered his rent and basic life necessities. He had a feeling soon that he would get a raise or a higher-up job in the factory. He rounded the corner onto Inman Street just as the sun was coming up.
Henry, good to see you, old pal. How you holding up?
James Wilson asked as Henry entered the building.
"I'm holding,"
Henry replied with a slight smirk. James was a good guy. He was nice, smart, and down to earth. He was Henry's only true friend. James was quite the social kid growing up. He had a lot of friends. Henry made his way into the mill and started working. As Henry was trimming a sheepskin, he reflected on his childhood. He had not gotten any answers from his father, so he was always caught trying to piece together distant memories. He thought back to his mother. He was surprised to find the long-suppressed memories suddenly flowing so easily into his mind, searching for answers to the enigma that was his last 10 years. Henry's family had owned a substantial dairy farm before things went awry. Everybody knew the Herefords. Back in the day, Gerald, Henry's father, did well for himself. He was considered a fairly successful man at the time. Susan Hedford was a stay-at-home mom who had a large heart, yet knew when to lay down the law. She was a very loving woman until someone threatened her child. That brought out the devil in her. Henry could recall many vivid memories of his mother tucking him in at night, falling asleep to the sound of her reading to him. In Henry's youth, Susan had developed a terminal illness, heralding the dreadful horrors to come. Gerald poured countless amounts of money into doctors working on pioneering untested methods for the treating of her illness. He borrowed his neighbor's Ford and drove as far as Knoxville and even down to Atlanta, hoping to find a cure. The illness had never been seen anywhere, and some doctors said the nature of her illness made no biological sense. She just got worse. Susan Hedford died on November 19, 1918. Henry was 13. Gerald was devastated. This moment marked the transition from normalcy to undistilled horror. After her death, Gerald spent many weeks either at the bar or passed out in the living room of their farmhouse. He could not bear existence without his Susan, his lifelong lover. Drinking took up most of his hours. He was completely hopeless until the day he met a strange man from rural Mississippi. This man claimed he knew how to resurrect Gerald's deceased wife. He claimed he had access to ancient wisdom, pagan scrolls from days long ago. Gerald was appalled at first. Being raised a strict Christian, he would have never entertained the thought. Except, how could a kind God take away a man's reason for life? This thought floated through Gerald's head. It kept him up at night, until finally deciding to seek out the traveler from Mississippi. He couldn't tell Henry any of this. If he could get his mother back, Henry would understand. After a long debate about claims of spirituality, the conversation solidified.
What exactly is required for this to work? I won't allow evil near me if I don't have a good reason.
Gerald asked the traveler.
Sir, I was as hesitant as you before I saw the truth. As I have come to believe, the whole Christian theology has been misinterpreted. The devil is not the adversary. He is the rebel against the forces that control. The true evil is in what the Lord allows to be done. Freedom is in fighting these elusive barriers that he sets in place.
How can you damn your soul without even thinking twice? I'm almost ready to walk out that there door right this moment.
Tell me this. How can you accept a Savior that condemns you to misery? A Savior that has locked the door of content forever shut?
Gerald paused at this, his eyes fixed at his feet. A single tear welled in his right eye.
I loved her so much. I never thought I'd have to see a day without her smile.
Gerald's face furrowed.
I milked those cows there for her. I built this house for her. I never knew. I awoke only because of her.
After a long pause, Gerald looked the stranger square in the eyes.
I would do anything for her.
And that was that. Chapter 2. Oh, what pain will make a man do. As Henry was trimming a sheepskin, he found himself reflecting on the events following his father's encounter with the traveler. Although he wasn't around during much of it, he still witnessed enough to end the average man. He thought back on all the stories of cows being left half-eaten across town, all the helpless children that had gone missing. This was all shortly after his mom had passed. His father had become strange around this time. He was often seen doing strange things in dim light. People would hear strange incantations emanating from his form. In contemplation, it was almost as if these memories had some sort of direct link to the temporal space that he was in. Almost as if they had a primal necessity to his existence. He felt his balance dance a little. Henry had not known what to make of any of this at that time. His father ended up asking that he leave the house, so he stayed at a small townhouse for people with nowhere to stay. He had worked as a dishwasher for about a year before making his way to the mill. The few encounters with his father were always short-lived and strange. He was desperately alone at this time, with no support. This was only exacerbated when his father's withered corpse was found sprawled on the shore of the cold Ocoee River. Gerald asked the man for evidence of his resurrecting powers in order to know that he was not getting conned. The two found themselves in between Cleveland and Ocoee, an area inhabited by very few people. They came upon a pack of vultures, furiously tearing out the guts of a rabbit. In the presence of the two men, the birds took flight, indignantly squawking at their inconvenient disruption.
Vultures are very underappreciated birds, Gerald. They are ridiculed for their ghastly appearance or their scavenging instincts. They are the great cleaners, Gerald. They fix what the rest of us leave to ruin. They help restore order. The world is very unorderly. That is the great calling.
What is your reasoning behind helping me? I don't see much in it for you.
I am here to rectify what is unjust. I am here to help those who have been treated wrongly. That is the Ancient One's will. Come, let me show you.
The two walked over to the rabbit. Its guts lay in ruin, blood seeping onto the road. The stranger bent and stroked its fur kindly. He put his fingers in the blood, tasting it. With the rest, he drew a circle around the creature, making sure no empty spaces were left.
You said you wanted proof. They love to show their work, but only to worthy eyes.
Who are they?
Gerald asked, suddenly questioning his decision to seek the aid of this strange man.
Everything in life comes in multiplicity, Gerald. Everything. You are not you. The ancients knew this. You are a collective of sub-personalities, Gerald. You have just chosen to coalesce into a singular being, mostly out of fear of what may lurk beneath. Your moods switch all the time. What makes you think you aren't different people in each instance?
What does this have to do with anything? Who are they?
If you can be so many people at once, what makes you think they can't take many forms?
Who are they?
Gerald's fear crescendoed, creating an abrupt change in his tone.
You prove my point right now. There are many beings that exist outside our perception, just as there are many yous that exist outside of your consciousness. Too many to name. Let me show you what they desire you to understand.
The stranger walked around the animal, sat down, and began chanting.
O Sulaku, Minurada. O Sulaku, Minurada.
He continued for some time. Gerald looked around skeptically to see if anyone was watching this strange undertaking. The air took on a frigid, rough texture. Gerald began to feel a strange power, as if it was encroaching on their space. He fixed his gaze intently on the butchered animal.
O Sulaku!
Gerald heard voices intruding into his mind, a choir of demonic chatter. His vision blurred. He saw what had happened to the animal, how the dog broke its neck, how it ate its full. He then saw separating timelines of how the rabbit could have survived, how it could have run up the tree avoiding death. Suddenly, these strange visions ended. It was fully dark, although to Gerald it felt like a matter of minutes. The stranger stared fixedly on the animal and started to chuckle. Gerald looked closer, and after some time he saw the foot twitch. He saw the neck turn slightly. The rabbit locked gaze with the humans and instinctively darted off. At this point, the stranger burst into laughter. When he calmed himself down, he said,
You see, Gerald, it's not as much about bringing the soul back. It's about showing it that it has the power to come back. It never died. It only believed the tale.
After fully being convinced of this man's power, Gerald offered him to stay at his farmhouse to better be initiated into the techniques of the man. Gerald found that the stranger only ate one meal a day and never seemed to sleep. He could be heard making strange rumblings at any hour of the night. Nevertheless, he let the man stay with him so they could plan the resurrection. The man didn't like talking about his methods, or even hinting at their origins. He would only say that they were spawned by the Ancient Ones. Long hours were spent priming Susan's soul for retrieval, or at least that is what the stranger called it.
The travel back into the body is not as easy for a complex being such as a human. They seek to stay in the expanse, so you have to magnify their purpose for returning,
he explained. Gerald was very confused much of the time. He had never been so close to such lurid practices.
It's time to get the body,
the stranger told Gerald one day. Gerald had feared this moment almost as much as he feared the others. He didn't look forward to looking into the eyes of his decaying lover. In the middle of the night they made their way over to Fort Hill Cemetery. As they approached, time seemed almost to stop. The unreality of this experience, the strange path he had entered, all hung heavily in his present awareness. The moon shone down, lighting up the hotel for the dead. As they made their way to where Susan had been buried, the thickening tree-shadowed ground seemed to undulate of its own accord. Gerald moved his lantern toward the engraving on the tombstone. His eyes widened when he saw that instead of January 27, 1885, to November 18, 1918, it was now replaced only by January 27, 1885. They dug the coffin out in an hour. Gerald eyed the man to see if he was going to take the lid off.
This is your path, not mine,
he answered his gaze. Gerald lifted up the lid, slowly at first, and then all at once. A snake emerged, slithering over the top of his left arm. It quickly disappeared. Gerald recoiled and held back a scream. He tried again. This time his advancing hand encountered a mass of scurrying insects. Calming down, he looked at what remained of Susan. Her skin had obtained a whitish purple hue. Her body was limp, much smaller in form. He looked into her sunken, reddened eyes and saw them twitch, or at least so he thought. It must be my mind. They loaded her into the back of the wagon and quickly left. Chapter 3. The Soul Transference. Gerald creaked open the back door of the farmhouse. He went inside and lit the oil lantern illuminating the now messy wooden interior. They carried Susan through the kitchen into the living room. There were papers, candles, and strange writing all over the walls and floor. The flickering lantern lit the scene and was reflected in Gerald's desperate eyes.
Okay, let's make this quick. I can hardly handle looking at her in this state,
Gerald said.
Time, all things in due time. We can't rush the others. We are blessed they are willing to work with us in the first place,
the stranger retorted. Over the next few days, Gerald and the stranger were tasked with extensive preparations. Among them, they were told by the others to arrange a bed for Susan, a bed made of dirt, algae, and a plethora of various insects. They created the ritual bed in the living room, thus securing the house as utterly disgusting. The windows and doors were boarded up, thus ensuring no one could view their sinister acts. The stranger could be seen watering the bed and making sure no worms crawled out. Susan's body smelled increasingly atrocious. Luckily, there were no neighbors nearby. Susan's decomposing body was falling apart. Skin would often be found, scattered around the house, and hair matted everything. One late night, a week and a half later, the stranger walked into the kitchen to speak to Gerald. Gerald was busy preparing a cup of coffee and was startled by the stranger's presence.
Sorry to bother you at this hour. I know you haven't been sleeping well.
You're fine. What's on your mind? Is it time?
Yes, it is time. The others have told me the blood moon is a sign that all is in order.
Gerald had noted the moon. It seemed to be staring at him, judging his actions, curious to see how this would unfold. Gerald hurried into the living room and looked down at his wife. He couldn't imagine the corpse becoming animate again. Yet he still held faith. They placed her carefully on the bed and lit some lanterns. The moon pierced through the slits of the boarded-up windows to get a view. If only the two could see what lay outside their realm, what horrors awaited anxiously behind the veil of sanity.
As you know, Gerald, I have been in steady communication with Susan over the last few days, as her soul has been preparing arrival. She broke down in tears last time we spoke. She said she wanted to be in your arms once again. She said she was sorry for not telling you she loved you more often.
Gerald shifted, brushed away a tear, and refocused.
It won't be much longer then, my dear Susan. Let's get started.
They lit the 4 candles set up on all 4 sides of Susan. They represented the 4 elements and had intensive sigils drawn around them all. On top of Susan's body they had placed a gem that instantly reflected the moon's light in strange angle. Cries, chants, and yells were exclaimed for many hours. Strange motions were performed that night. All throughout Cleveland people reported demonic dreams. Many did not tell their dreams as they were too frightening to be spoken aloud. After a considerable amount of time, Susan's hand began to twitch. The two stopped their rituals and watched closely. Her left arm hanging off the altar began to clench, flinch, twist, and then finally lay still. Her head snapped suddenly toward them, skin dangling loosely. Her eyes were a deep crimson red, mirroring the moon's disturbing appearance. She smiled.
Susan?
Gerald said almost inaudibly. Susan locked eyes and smiled wider.
We brought you back.
She stared at the ceiling, engulfed in mirth. She suddenly stopped, sat up, and looked confused.
Gerald? Is that really you? I can't tell dream from reality. I'm not truly back, am I?
Yes, you're here with me.
Gerald approached her arms out. Susan broke out in another screech of laughter.
Susan is dead, you fool. I am no Susan. I am the shadow that you lie cast upon the streets.
She levitated slightly, and then proceeded to flip the table violently into the wall. She spoke again, this time in a deep voice.
You have all brought me back, and I... Thank you. But now you must die. Even if this body rots, I will still prevail.
Susan, I know you're in there. Talk to me.
Gerald screamed. More laughter. The stranger looked very confused.
No. How can this be? I have served you all for countless ages. How could you dupe me?
You have played your part well, traveler. Yet your tale comes to an end. Consider this your magnum opus. I'm sure the others will be pleased. Yet your tale must come to a close.
The demon retorted. Despite seeing death many times, a look of true horror bathed the traveler's countenance. He ran towards the door, only to be met by a violent thrust from the demon. He was slammed against the opposite wall and dropped to the floor. The demon flew over him, holding the collar of his shirt. She began caressing him on the cheek as a small, yet sinister smile inhabited her face.
You always were a looker. You always were. So much potential you had. If you hadn't fucked it up.
That was ages ago. I have repaid myself many times.
The traveler screamed into the night as the demon plunged her razor-sharp fingernails into his stomach. With unnatural force she ripped out his bowels, the light duplicating them in sinister proportion on the wall. She shoved them in his mouth to dampen his voice. After a minute the traveler's eyes stilled, frozen with shock. The demon's face turned at an impossible angle, peering intently at Gerald, who was frozen against the wall with fear.
It can't be! How could you do this?
he made out.
I've been waiting a long time to come back to this wretched town. I have unfinished business. You both made an excellent opportunity we may never get again,
She said as she slowly walked over to Gerald.
He had it coming. Even from his childhood years he was a natural at communicating with the others. But he was always a fool.
Closer now, she bent over Gerald, dripping blood and skin fragments on his frightened face. She drew back her hand to strike, and then paused. A look of sadness appeared on her face. She tried again to strike, and failed. Her face grew worrisome. She shook her head as astonishment engulfed her. She recoiled, exclaiming a bone-shaking screech as she flew backward, head first, out of the window. The boards fell loudly to the floor. Gerald opened his eyes and was met with the sight of a bloody moon that now seemed to be smirking at him. After some time of disoriented gaze, Gerald fell asleep. The moon watched.
Probably gonna cry. Probably gonna cry. Probably gonna cry. Probably gonna cry. Probably gonna cry.